Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Wabandato. I am a program officer at the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. This is another in our series of town halls in which we bring together folks who are knowledgeable about various land ownership and land management topics to help answer questions that you have. The intent of my town halls are to closely reflect a question and answer format so that you're able to ask your questions and get the answers for your own use. I do have questions prepared to help guide some of the conversation, but we certainly welcome through the chat feature for you to submit questions to me. Again, tonight we're going to be talking about the agricultural resource management planning. I've got Will Seeley. He is with the Blackfeet Nation. If you would introduce yourself briefly, Will, and then we'll get started shortly thereafter.
Yeah, definitely. My name's Will Seeley. I'm currently the acting director for the Blackfeet Nation's Agriculture Resource Management Plan. I also do some work at Blackfeet with a local nonprofit, the Pecunny Lodge Health Institute, as a project manager looking into some feasibility of multi-species processing as well. And thanks for having me, Jim.
Wonderful, thank you. I will mention as we get started and then at the wrap up that this is question and answer format. So submit your questions in the chat and I can get them addressed as appropriate. Also mention that going into November and December, the holidays will throw off my fourth Tuesday schedule. Those are holiday weeks and or the holidays themselves. And so I do and will have a modified schedule for the next 2 months. On 11/16, and you'll get an email for this, we'll have a session on landowner knowledge, skills, and abilities. And then in December, at the request and a smart, intuitive way to look at it, we will discuss gift deeds in December on December 14th. Having said that, again, tonight's topic of agricultural resource management planning is something that I think a lot of landowners do not have very much information and it's not very well understood. And as such, like I said, I've got Will. I'll start off. Will, can you tell us what an ARMP is?
Yeah, generally, I would describe it as a 10-year holistic management plan, and it really allows a tribal nation to define and set their priorities for how they want to manage their agricultural resources. And that language of holistic actually gives the tribe a broad view of what could be considered an agricultural resource. That language comes from the ARMP Act of 1993, but it gives you pretty much it allows the tribal nation to really take control and set priorities that are beneficial, specific to the needs of that tribe and the tribe's agricultural producers, and as well as preventing, it gives you you can set a 10-year plan, and it prevents a lot of the issues that can come with turnover when it comes to leadership and employees and things like that, and sets out a long-term direction for agricultural resource management goals and objectives for that tribe and the way the community defines those.
Okay. Now, as an individual landowner or as a community member, why should I pay attention to the tribe's ARMP? Why is it important to me?
I think it is really important when it comes down to giving a landowner or a tribal community member the opportunity to have their voices heard and expressed to the tribal government, and as well as creating some directives for federal agencies, whether it be NRCS, BIA, FSA, to outline what is important to the landowners, what's important to the farmers and the ranchers, where do we see the major issues, and also outline how do the people on the ground see a good way to actually approach and fix some of the issues that may cause barriers when it comes to entry into agriculture, or general operations of an agricultural business, as well as accessing federal support programs through NRCS and FSA, those types of things. There's a wide breadth of things that can be covered, and it's a really great opportunity for the landowners and the community members to have their voices heard and written into a concrete plan that defines that direction for the foreseeable future. And in this case specifically, 10 years or so, for the next 10 years. So that's kind of where I see the importance of it, line for the landowners and community members.
Mhm. What I would like to do is kind of read off. So the primary management objectives of the Agricultural Resource Management Plan, as spelled out by the ARMA law, American Indian Agricultural Resource Management Act law, state that the primary management objectives of a tribal ARMP are to protect, conserve, and utilize agricultural lands through sound practices, increase production and expand diversity of agricultural products in a tribal community, manage ag resources consistent with an IRMP or an ARMP, and enable native farmers and ranchers to maximize benefits of agriculture on their land by providing business and conservation education and resources, develop Indian ag and value-added industries, and assist trust and restricted fee landowners in leasing their agricultural lands for reasonable returns. When I read through that list, Will, what are a couple of the ways that you address that in your agricultural resource management plan?
I think, we kind of wanted we've seen it as each of our aspects that we look at really tends to touch on each of those things. We want to keep each of those things in mind as we set our goals and objectives. I think I'd have to run through that list again, Jim, but it's quite a lot of things that you can fit into here. So
Sure.
for Blackfeet specifically, we really developed what we call our triple bottom line. And so essentially that was, investment or economic development through investments in our private sector economy, which our largest contributor to our private sector economy in the Blackfeet country is agriculture. So we wanted to make sure we were focusing on utilizing agriculture to drive our private sector economic development. And a lot of that can come down to addressing, like you said, there's land leasing issues, increasing the usability of federal trust land, whether it be, getting a right of way, things like that, looking at how we can reduce those barriers that native producers, a lot of native producers face in utilizing their land for agricultural production. The other piece of that we really wanted to utilize was how do we make, through those investments in agriculture, how do we utilize agriculture to address our food sovereignty and health disparities of Blackfeet people. I think when you look at it, about 9 out of 10 of the top 10 killers of Blackfeet people can be directly correlated to diet and food consumption and those types of things. So looking at that area as well, and how we can utilize that to affect the health of Blackfeet people. And then at the same time, we want to, in every piece of that, we also wanted to look at how do we make investments in our youth, especially in agriculture. There's how do we look at different forms of agriculture that aren't so land intensive, because there's not quite as much available land for our youth that are interested in agriculture? How do we provide, make it, that barrier of entry a little bit easier for them to get into it as they're interested, and as well as providing those educational opportunities for them. I think our average age of farmers and ranchers, I think last time I looked, was around 56 years old or so, and continues to increase. So if we how do we pass that institutional knowledge on to our youth and ensure that, you know, all that years of experience are able to be utilized by them, and what opportunities we could, as, you know, a tribal government, and I report directly to our conservation district. So from their perspective as well, provide opportunity for the future of agriculture for the Blackfeet Nation. And so we call that our triple bottom line, and try to keep that as continually through everything that we do through our planning process.
So what I'm hearing with your triple bottom line is that the planning process and having prioritized agricultural resource management at the Blackfeet Nation has influenced other tribal programs. Now, you mentioned youth. Are there other programs that are a direct result of your planning effort?
Yeah, I mean, well, first, you know, in the beginning when we first started, we noticed that there was quite a bit of silos in between, you know, in particularly the different tribal departments that do touch on different pieces of agricultural and natural resources management. So one of our first steps that we wanted to take was really trying to de-silo those and bolster the communications among different departments, because what we noticed was the departments weren't talking back and forth, and when you look at it, each department's trying to do all the things at one time, and there's not quite a coordinated effort there, and it really stretches your resources thin. You know, everybody's competing for different funding streams, things like that. And so we spent a lot of time just building trust and communication in between different departments to try and build those lines of communication. And that also included our local nonprofits, regional partners, and all the different governments that are involved within the Blackfeet Nation as well. And just building that rapport back and forth, and ultimately looking at, you know, what has everybody been doing with their agricultural resource management? What are they currently doing, and any plans they might have in the future? And try to coordinate, you know, who's going to take which piece, and build that human capital investment into each of these goals and objectives that would ultimately be a part of our ARMP. And with the ultimate goal of increasing the chances that our plan will be more implementable by the time it's finalized, and have that investment from all these different departments that are willing to take on different responsibilities and all of that moving forward. And
one last question I'd like to ask about at the 60,000 foot level. Do you find that, as someone who works within conservation and agriculture, is your document very technical, or have you tried to make it accessible and usable by regular farmers and ranchers, as well as Indian landowners?
I think our primary goal is to have this come directly from our you know, land users, is kind of a general term we like to use. And the way that we went about doing that, we did push fairly hard in the beginning to be able to develop this in-house. In the beginning, you know, we were being encouraged to reach out to an outside, you know, consulting firm and bring them in and have them do that. But you don't really see, and I think in a conversation I had with our environmental assessment contractors yesterday, was that we were able to get a lot more, it seemed that we were able to get a lot more participation by kind of doing that grassroots outreach and building a consistent interdisciplinary team that would come together and help inform all of this. We hosted meetings with a cross sector of different stakeholders and land users. Over 3 years, we held monthly meetings that could have generally from up to 40 or 50 people in attendance, you know, ranchers from each of the 5 watersheds. We had hunters, gatherers, fishermen, all sorts of different representation at these meetings. And really utilized that to inform, and those ultimately resulted in a 2-day intensive strategic planning session where we defined, that group, core group defined the 5 pillars that we wanted to carry through, and then our, mission statement with the plan, as well as, our goals and objectives and timeline for the next 10 years. And what we wound up doing was we did leave that verbatim for a while, just to make sure the community knows that their voice made it into this document, and took a lot of verbatim quotes and things like that from that meeting, and that was beneficial for me for a while. So if I had, say, a rancher came in and had a question about, where's this in the plan, I could pull up almost an exact quote from them, and that it made it directly into our action plan. Moving forward into a little bit closer to approval, we did have to take that and pare it down a bit, just to make it more manageable lengthwise, and as well as to fit into the requirements set out by the BIA within our 638 contract that funded this work. So we did our best and spent a lot of time making sure that we took those comments directly from the community and pared those down and did our best to not lose any content. So we made sure that that voice still shined through, but we were still hitting the marks that we had to do to go through the final approval process. During this as well, we also, one of the big things that we noticed for the Blackfeet tribe was that we had a large lack of data. So we brought a lot of those community stakeholders from the community college and other organizations that had been involved in this and some future land planning, and developed a survey in-house that would address a lot of these questions that we were receiving from farmers and ranchers, and a lot of the gaps that we identified that needed to be filled. And we went out with community members, and I think the survey ended up being like 138 questions after we had a little too many cooks in the kitchen on that one, but we got it as small as we felt comfortable with. But we were able to go out directly and do some direct outreach and sit down with ranchers at their kitchen table and walk them through that, and got I think 700 or nearly 700 responses on that, which we were pretty proud of, and have been able to use a lot of that data to inform our planning as well, for those that may have not made the meeting and things like that. And that's been very informative for us too.
Okay, thank you. We have gotten a couple of questions from the audience, and so I am going to ask one of the first question. What is it? Have you worked with other tribes? Is there an ARMP template? I know Blackfeet Nation has been fairly open in its process and has made presentations over the last 3 years. But in your experience, is there something that people can actually use? Or is it kind of a process that each community is left to make up on its own?
I think one of the first things before I actually came on, my former supervisor spent a lot of time looking at other tribes, ARMPs that had already been created and existed out there, and looked at the different structures that they had taken and the different methods that they had used, and spent a good amount of time, determining what fit best for Blackfeet. So I think, and ultimately, I believe it would be up to that particular tribe and how they would want to approach it and what would work best for them. But from my experience, most other tribes have been pretty open and willing to share. You may have to send in a request for it or something like that. But if you find the right contact person, they are willing to share, their plans and allow you to use that as a potential template and see, what you like and don't like and might want to customize for your tribe specifically.
What I can add also is that I was not under the impression there are an actual ARMP template, but Indian Land Tenure Foundation has been working with the Intertribal Agriculture Council as well as the Indigenous Food and Agricultural Institute, which is based at the University of Arkansas. So in 2022, we do expect to have a more formal announcement about some of our activities, but we're still in the planning stages. But the overall goal is to help create resources, provide education and resource tools. And so as that comes to fruition, I can suggest to the audience to keep your eyes open for public announcements and distribution of that information. So we do recognize at our organizations that that's going to be critical. That's one of the ways that we connected with Will to bring him in and help talk tonight. Jumping backwards real quick, one of the audience members asked, how did you encourage participation in the meetings and completion of the surveys?
Yeah, the completions of the surveys, I think the most helpful part was, we had mixed reactions. I got, told to hit the road a couple of times at our annual powwow, asking people to take the survey. But I think our most effective method really was just to, promote that this is going to go directly towards the development of this document, and really encouraging the importance of this document, and that it is a way to ensure that farmers and ranchers' voices are heard from the tribal government level. I know on a lot of different government levels, whether it be tribal or non-tribal, there's a lot of farmers and ranchers that feel that their voices aren't heard or represented in government, and maybe their best interests aren't quite represented. So it's a really good opportunity through the ARMP, to encourage, to give their input, so that, you can't at the end of the process say, we didn't try to have direct input from on the ground. And then I think for getting some folks to fill it out, it was really important. We have 5 different watersheds within the Blackfeet Nation, and we assign survey takers to go basically door to door and set up appointments. None of us are professional survey people, and it was developed with in-house there. And so there's some of the survey questions, our farmers and ranchers got to thinking really critically on them, and they might have some, well, not in this situation, but maybe in this situation. So it was good to have survey takers that were, trained and sitting there and able to answer those questions and help walk them through filling those out. Most of the survey takers that we hired, we assigned them to their particular communities by watershed, basically. So, if it's somebody from down the road, there was a lot of people more willing and trusting in giving out that type of information, and taking the time to walk through those surveys. So I think that was some of the most helpful parts of it. And we did have a really good, in the beginning, we had a strong support for the development of this document from our ranching community that's heavily involved in, say, our conservation district and our stock growers association. And they invited their neighbors and told them to come up, and just keeping some continuity of updating the community and allowing a lot of room for their feedback. It seemed to be really important for us.
Okay, I'm going to use this next question to kind of finish up this part of the conversation and transition into another part. What does once a tribe does an agricultural resource management plan, what does that mean, or what does that do in a federal context? And I'll also kind of invite Carly Griffith Hutfed to participate if she'd like as well. Specifically as it relates to tribal authority, I know you mentioned leases and leasing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it really gives your producers and the tribe the teeth and the foundation they need to start addressing some of the foundational issues in some of these systems. I know talking to my conservation district just 2 or 3 weeks ago, they were, explaining me the history of why they wanted to go down the ARMP path, and a big piece of that was the leasing valuations and that leasing process, and wanted to be able to have a much larger effect on that. And so this as a tribal document can a lot of times give you the teeth that you need to start pushing for a change, as well as if this is approved, then it kind of creates a guidance towards the BIA and some of these federal agencies that this is what the tribe wants to do with their agricultural resource management. And I would also throw it over to Carly too. She probably has if she's willing to hop on too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Will, and thanks, Jim. I'm staying off camera. I got my Pfizer booster. I'm feeling like I got hit by a light or a small truck, but I would go even further than what Will said. It's not just guidance to the BIA, it's mandatory. The policies that are listed in the ARMP, there is provisions in IARMA, which is the statute that authorizes ARMPs to be developed, indicating that the BIA is required to aid and assist in implementation of the ARMP provisions. And that means enforcement. And so the question about whether an individual allottee can use the plan despite it being developed by the tribe, yes, absolutely. That's the intent. What's laid out in the ARMP is intended to be applicable across the reservation, and be something that is, lays out the policies and priorities of the tribe with regard to land management practices, natural resource management in the context of agriculture, and covers a variety of issues depending upon what the tribe chooses to include in that ARMP. So it's really a tool for tribal sovereignty with regard to ag resource management. And there's a lot of things that can be folded into that. And that community feedback portion is really critical in order to get that ARMP developed in a manner that it's going to be feasible, implementable, and supported. Because that grassroots buy-in is really critical to the long-term success and stability of an ARMP.
And I'm going to slightly tease you because you're an attorney. So if I understood what you're saying, are you suggesting that when the tribe passes laws in accordance with its ARMP, that'll take precedent over CFR?
That's a really great question, Jim. The way that IARMA is drafted, it indicates that the policies contained in the ARMP, so long as they do not conflict with the U.S. Constitution or any specific federal statute on point, would, yes, overrule the CFRs.
Wow, that's pretty powerful stuff then.
It is incredibly powerful, and it's a huge, huge tool that a lot of tribes are not realizing their opportunities with, and really provides an opportunity for a tribe to be very self-directed in land management practices. Everybody likes to joke around that the BIA stands for Boss and Indians around. This is a tool to flip the script on that and reverse who's bossing who around from that perspective, if we're going to be, colloquial about it.
Okay. In that question that you were kind of referring to, it mentions allotted, ceded, or fee simple lands. Does that apply to non-Indian fee lands, or only to lands that are owned by the tribe and tribal members?
I'm going to give you the lawyer answer on this. That is not 100% clear to me. Will might be able to answer that from a practical perspective as far as how implementation has looked for them. But I would need to do a little more research to give a definitive answer. I will say, yes, it applies to allotted lands. And yes, or trust, or any properties held in trust or restricted status. The fee lands, I personally would need to do a little bit more research on. I don't want to give you an answer that's wrong. My gut check says yes, 100% fee simple lands held by a tribal citizen. But I would defer to Will how the implementation has worked with Blackfeet.
I think Carly, I think your answer is probably as best as I could have, probably better than what I could have come up with as well. And then when it comes to seeded, I honestly have no clue on the area of seeded lands. I know for us, we have the the seeded strip of Glacier National Park, and there's yeah, I'm not really sure how to answer that one actually.
No, that's
And,
okay.
I think there's a strong argument to be made for fee simple lands to being under, the jurisdictional status of the tribe as far as an ARMP is concerned. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, one of the 5 tribes here in Oklahoma that's been heavily impacted by the McGirt decision and the re-recognition of, that jurisdictional sovereignty, first in the context of criminal jurisdiction, then expanding from there. We suspect that there are some additional jurisdictional authorities that have been retained, but, have been usurped for so long, not necessarily exercised. But I think there's a good argument to be made that tribal jurisdiction over fee simple lands, especially if it's within the reservation boundaries and the reservation has not been disestablished, there's a good argument for that.
Okay, and so one of the other questions that I had from the registration asked if, I think primarily for Will, but we can look more broadly speaking, does a tribal management plan include allotments on and off the reservation? And some of our communities, it's questionable whether the exterior boundaries have been diminished. In other locations, we've got public domain allotments. And so how does if a tribe passes one, does it have an impact on those off-reservation lands as well?
For Blackfeet specifically, I'm unaware that of any allotments that are outside of the exterior bounds of the reservation. So I don't have much experience in that exactly. I'd be willing to wager yes. I don't know. I would also throw that to Carly. She's got a lot more knowledge on that from that perspective than I do. I don't know. Carly, if you have anything.
So what I'll do is I'll repeat Jim's answer. We're working on developing some resources, and based on the feedback and questions that we're getting in these sessions, will inform the resources that we are developing. So I would say I don't have 100% clear answer for you right now, but that is something that we will work on and hope to provide to you in 2022. So be on the lookout for resources coming down the pipe through a joint collaboration with the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative, the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, and the Intertribal Ag Council.
Thank you, Carly. I appreciate that help. Let me see. Question asks about where did your funding come from to do the ARMP at Blackfeet Nation? Did you get it through your 638 contract, your tribal priority allocation under that? Were there additional grants or funding mechanisms that you pursued to complete the process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we started out with a 638 contract, and so that was entered into from the Blackfeet Natural Resource Conservation District. They really pushed to go down the ARMP path and put together the proposal to the BIA to receive those 638 funds and enter into that self-determination contract. And we did receive funds and then it was originally set to be completed within 3 years as a stipulation of that for our conservation district to be selected for that funding. The BIA did require that we ran that funding through the tribal government and their finance department and all of those things to manage those funds. And we did receive I don't know if you could call it a blanket resolution, but a kind of a general resolution that allowed our program to pursue outside funding to go towards any planning efforts that would contribute to the completion of the ARMP, which prevented us from having to do a lot of running around to get a travel resolution every time that we wanted to apply for some funding. So we did apply for quite a bit of outside funding. We focus primarily on private funders due to the fact that their reporting requirements are a lot less cumbersome, and you get a little more leeway with the uses of the money and things as you're, kind of breaking new ground. Things are always going to be changing and different. It reduces on, we had a pretty shoestring staff, and it reduced a lot of our time and having to go through paperwork and things like that to adjust a project that we were trying to get done. We did jump the gun a little bit with some of our projects just to so we weren't cold starting after the ARMP, the final approval of the ARMP. We did start down on a few of the projects that we knew for sure were going to be as a part of the goals and objectives in our ARMP, and we're able to go after and receive fundings for different projects, as well as developing one thing I always suggest is we developed a really close partnership with the local nonprofit, Peccary Lodge Health Institute, which has provided us a lot of flexibility in the different types of funds, and as well as the amount of administrative hurdles you have to navigate to process funds, payment, travel, things like that, by going with that partnership with the nonprofit. So I always suggest, if you can develop that type of relationship with the local nonprofit to assist you in carrying out your goals and objectives, I highly recommend it. So that's it did take quite a bit of outside funding, and as we for Blackfeet specifically decided to do it in-house, it did come with a lot of capacity building needs and bringing our tribal employees along with us to make sure that after the plan is completed, they had that training and that background to carry out into implementation and everything. So it did add a little bit of extra time. So I do like to tell people not to be afraid to request an extension from BIA if you can't get it done in the 3 years, because you do want to make sure that you take the time to do the proper planning, build that consensus in your community, as well as, ultimately it's going to affect the successfulness of your plan and the implementation of it. So originally it was supposed to be completed in 3 years. I think we're rolling into year 5, but that's kind of as things go. But so don't be afraid to, ask for an extension if it's needed.
Oh, sure. I think COVID has certainly delayed a lot of projects. I know here at the foundation, we've been the beneficiary of grant extensions, and in our own grant making, we've extended those projects as well. So yeah, there's nothing to be ashamed of over the last year and a half and keeping things moving ahead. The second part of the question asked about other sources of funding, and I'll just reiterate that that is one of the things that we'll take into account, that our information as we send it out over the next year will include potential opportunities for funding as a list, and to help tribal communities better understand how they can do the various phases of the project. And speaking of phases, could you perhaps describe for us, Will, some of the major steps in developing an ARMP?
Yeah, I'd say first, from my experience, it was, our conservation district had to get together, and for some background, our conservation district is a board of 8 members, and we have ex officio members from Extension and RCS, the tribal government, and a couple others. And they got together and decided they wanted to take on the project. So they put together and got the tribe on board to back them in pushing to receive that 638 contract and begin the process. Following that, they hired my former supervisor on, I think not too far after that. And then I came on a few months after him through an AmeriCorps program actually, but and was able to stick around. And then one of the first things that he did, and this might address Michael's question as well in the chat. One of the first things he did was look around, like I said, at the ARMPs that had been developed and take a look at those and see, you know, what kind of templates are out there and what already exists, because to avoid reinventing the wheel anywhere that you can is always helpful. The other thing, and this might go towards Michael's question here, was to look at what, what tribal plans and inventories have already been created through those other tribal departments, and bringing them along and getting an update on what's already out there, what kind of resolutions that the tribe may have already regulating the agricultural resources, and get a sense for the environment that you're rolling into. As well as looking at, we looked at NAS data and really realized that was skewed. One of the big things that we noticed from a lot of our plans was that you really wind up with a nice inventory, but a lot of them aren't quite as actionable. We wanted to ensure that ours was more implementable by assigning first we wanted to decide, a human capital and as well as a timeline. So basically who's going to do it and when it'll be done was one of the things that we gathered from researching the other plans that had been done. But we also saw, how old a lot of our data was and how many data gaps that we actually had. I think our last rangeland inventory in Blackfeet had been done 20 or 30 years ago, something like that. Same with our fence line inventory, things like that. So one of the big things that came out of that was the need to develop our own data, own our own data, and where those huge gaps were that we needed to fill. Following that, and I think the next thing that's beneficial for folks is to start building partnerships with other organizations. So, locally, regionally, and nationally, and start talking with them and working, across the Indian country on how to move forward and what other tribes are doing and all of that. And start building that those relationships and partnerships that it's going to take to carry your plans out was really beneficial. And then just building that community rapport, like I was talking about earlier, that interdepartmental and rapport back and forth, and trust from your community, especially those that are on the ground ag resource managers. Are going to be your guiding force throughout the whole process, and I know for us, we're more than willing to tell us, where we needed to go and where they'd like to see us go with the process. And then following that, with our when it comes to the NEPA requirements for an ARMP, I was speaking with our environmental assessment contractors yesterday, and she mentioned in the past, a lot of tribes usually will bring in their environmental assessor first, depending on your BIA regional office and different requirements there. But a lot of tribes would bring them in first, and they would do some of that coordination on the ground. But I would suggest trying to do, I think she said after working with us, it seemed to get more feedback if you did that the other way around. The other thing I kind of like to suggest is if you do need to do an EA, go ahead and have your action plan finalized, so you don't happen to do an EA, and if you edit it and add, some different type of project in there and then have to redo it, that kind of thing. And you can, from my understanding, utilize that EA if you do have a bigger project. For example, we had our meat processing facility we wanted to look at, which we can denote needs its own site-specific environmental assessment, but those can be built off that programmatic EA that's required under the ARMP Act. So that's another thing to keep in mind as you're going through that and deciding, you know, when and how you want to approach that. Let's see. And then following that, for our process specifically, we're going to be looking at, we had to go out for a, do a notice of availability. I think it's for 30 days to the community, and then a 30-day comment period following that for our ARMP, and to incorporate any comments or concerns from the community. Following that, it would go to our conservation district to give their, you know, final thumbs up on, and ultimately to our tribal government for their approval, and then out to our regional BIA, I think, for that final, you know, checked off the list that we hit all of our marks for the project. And then so looking at, we'll be navigating that process here in the near future. So we haven't completely gone through that just yet, but that's the way we understand it needs to be done.
Like to interject real briefly. When Will was talking about, you know, what data was available and collecting that. IARMA indicates that any data that is held by a federal agency or a publicly funded university that receives federal funds, all of that data is supposed to be made available to the tribe upon request in order to get the information needed. So any surveys performed, any maps, any, you know, like USGS well plotting, whether it's, you know, DOI, BIA, BLM, whatever alphabet, federal alphabet soup you can think of, if there is data that is collected about tribal resources that would be encompassed by an ARMP, that data is supposed to be turned over.
Thank you, Carly. In the comments, there was a notice that the ARMPs under ARMA are unfunded mandates. And so there was a question about whether that could go into the Farm Bill. Carly had commented that the Farm Bill has to do with the Department of Agriculture, whereas the ARMA law applies to the Department of Interior and specifically Bureau of Indian Affairs. That is something that I think people need to realize, is that there is a certain amount of expectation in one hand, but isn't being met except through resources at another hand. And so those two sections of the US federal government don't always work together. I think that's one of the frustrating things that our group is going to see what we can do to address. I do know that USDA does have additional resources. Will, can you talk about the role that some of the USDA departments or agencies have had in your ARMP development process, such as the Natural Resource Conservation Service or other bureaus?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of our projects that we've been working with NRCS on was to, you know, essentially create process maps of, you know, what are the different steps that our producers have to go through to access NRCS programs, and map that out, and hopefully make it clear for them and easier for, and less frustrating for them to walk through that process and know exactly where they're at. It's more or less been an informational sharing thing between us and the NRCS and FSA, and they've participated in our meetings and development of the ARMP. But we have been working with them to try and ease and increase our local participation in those programs. And from that, it's mostly just been informational sharing, and they've been willing to come out and do any, you know, education that we might request and things like that. on top of it, our Montana just switched to the model of targeted implementation plans for NRCS, and we've been heavily involved with that and for their upcoming couple of years. But they've been a good partner in trying to figure out how to continue working with them and increase our involvement in their programs, and how we might ease some of the requirements to access those programs for our producers on trust land specifically. And what we would ultimately like to do is map out the processes for different land functions, as well as at the BIA and NRCS, and ultimately assign an economic value to those, so we could make the case that we might be able to simplify these processes for native producers on federal trust land.
All right. Sending out a follow-on question. No, that's all good information. I appreciate that. Let's see here. Had one of the registration questions, and I wasn't sure where it would fit. So while I'm getting some feedback on follow-up question, is there any advantage to organic or non-GMO farmers in the tribe adopting an ARMP?
Yeah, I think it is, and Carly might be able to hop in here too. I jump immediately to the model food and ag code that the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative had put together, and the ability in here, if you outline within the ARMP that you would like to define your own standards, and whether those be organic, grass-fed, non-GMO, we have a particular project that's looking into this. Can as a tribe define your own standards for those? I mean, there's it's still a question for us. Do they have to follow the federal standards, or can we we could define our own. So I think within the ARMP, you can lay the groundwork for the tribe to start to define their own standards in those areas. We're looking at beef specifically right now, but ultimately for most of our agricultural products. Carly, I don't know if you could have any more information there.
Yeah. So ARMPs, as being a tool of tribal sovereignty, can reflect a variety of, tribal preferences and implementation practices. I know some tribes are looking at restricting application of certain types of, pesticides or fungicides or insecticides in order to preserve certain species or management practices. And so, an organic or non-GMO related opportunity could be something that, if that's the tribe's preferences, they may also designate, certain sensitive areas to be managed in a way that's different or more conservative than other parcels, just depending upon what those critical resources may be, whether it's adjacent to an important waterway, or there's been, a lot of environmental degradation that would require some, special handling, or, just any kind of issue that really would warrant a tribal preference. Tribes can make their policy priorities reservation wide. So if a tribe wants to implement, no neonicotinoids to preserve pollinators, if they want to implement that policy and have it be applicable across the board, across the reservation, that's something that can be done. Or, some tribes may want to specifically require certain types of land management practices. So there's a lot of flexibility as far as what policies can be implemented and adopted. And like Will mentioned, the Model Tribal Food and Ag Code is something that we at IFAI host. If you just Google Model Food and Ag or Model Tribal Food and Ag Code, it'll come up. You do have to log in and get an account to be able to review that, but we have a section specific to those types of considerations in legislation, and they're customizable. We're working on going through and providing different customization examples so that tribes can get ideas about what kind of options are available. I don't think that portion of the code has quite been updated yet, but again, that's something to look for in 2022.
So we're nearing the end. I am going to go ahead and just make an assumption. As part of the project that Carly and I have mentioned a couple of times, we are looking at trying to make sure that there is more transparent information for communities considering ARMPs. And so part of that process will be to include relevant data for inventories and for other purposes. Again, because the process is ongoing, if there is feedback from community members and from tribal leaders, we certainly would like to include that in the development process. It is going to be partnered up with a separate project that several of us have been working on to create data dashboards that will, again, it's a product that'll be launched in 2022. So again, as that becomes available, we certainly will make sure that you know what's going on. As we've hit the end, I want to make sure that Will has a chance for any final parting thoughts or issues that perhaps you felt like I didn't give you a chance to address.
No, I think it was great, and I appreciate the opportunity to visit with everybody. And please, if you have any other questions I might be able to help with, feel free to email me. I don't know, Jim, if you're able to share my email with everybody. We'd be happy to try and answer them for you. If not, I'll just call Carly.
Yeah, I can certainly make sure that your information is available to anyone who requests it. Carly, did you have any parting thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, I was just gonna say I dropped my email in the chat. I'm just at hotvet@uark.edu. And any questions or concerns, happy to take those and see if I can, do some research to answer your questions if I don't know it off the top of my head. But I'm really looking forward to being able to develop these resources that are going to be really critical to informing tribes, because I think there's, kind of been a deficit of knowledge as far as, what the opportunities are with ARMPs. And I'm sure Will can speak to that. I probably kind of felt like they were reinventing the wheel, or when it came to developing their own ARMP at Blackfeet, because it was so comprehensive and in depth, and really kind of was an example of that. And they really forged the road ahead. And it's been a good learning experience in order to identify what resources are needed in order to make it easier for tribes and not having to just figure it out on their own. So we know that this is a really great resource. It's a good opportunity, but it's going to require some additional supports to make it feasible and practical and implementable.
Thank you both. And I appreciate the audience coming in this evening. As I mentioned at the outset, there will be a post-presentation survey sent out. It will include a link for this video. I would expect that before the end of this week. Also want to highlight that as we go into November and December, that I do have landowner knowledge, skills, and abilities as a topic to discuss in our town hall in November. But because of Thanksgiving week, that's going to be moved up to November 16th. And again, the fourth Thursday of December is a holiday week. And so December 14th is going to be for gift deeds. Again, thank you everyone for attending. And I certainly am excited when folks participate in the Q&A. The key thing that I want to share with Indian Country is that these are tools and resources to help address your concerns, to get answers to the questions you have, and to find solutions for the problems that you're experiencing. When we're here working at a national level for Indian Country, we have a voice and we have the ability to bring that to DC, but without your input, without your struggles, we don't know all the time what are going to be important issues. So again, thank you everyone for stopping in tonight.